This is System Crash, a weekly tech news show willing to tell the hard truths about how tech and the titans who own and operate it is really transforming the world. I'm Paris Marks.
And I am Brian Merchant.
This system has just begun to crash, so support the show by heading over to patreon.com/systemcrashpod, where you can sign up to get monthly bonus episodes. Also, rate the show on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you listen. Now, Brian, it seems that your country has launched an economic war on my country, and this is not okay.
America first, motherfucker.
Yeah, you're wearing your MAGA cap around now in blazing red. Or are you dark MAGA?
I'm doing this podcast from the bed of a Ford pickup truck, wearing a cowboy hat, and I'm grilling a steak in a barbecue. It's too bad we haven't done live video feeds yet, because this would be the time.
Meanwhile, I have a snowman behind me, and I have a Canada flag wrapped around my neck and a nice toucan, because of course. And I have a whole plate of pancakes here with maple syrup drizzled all over them, because maple syrup is ours.
Vermont would like a word.
Yeah, fuck Vermont. No offense,
What?
Vermont.
I was on your side until you said that.
But maple syrup is Canadian. Like, we make the most of it. Like the vast
It's
majority.
true. You did put it on the flag and everything.
Exactly.
So I guess
It's ours.
We'll let you have that.
But look, okay, the big story, and there is a tech angle to this. Okay, we will get to it, but we want to kind of lay out the details first. So we know that Donald Trump has been talking about putting tariffs on plenty of countries for a long time, but for whatever reason, very soon after he was elected, his ire seemed to go immediately to Canada and Mexico, the United States' closest allies, neighbors, trade partners. Why exactly? Well, maybe we do have a reason. Actually, I was going to say we don't know, but maybe we do. But anyway, so after some delays and stuff, on Monday of this week, the Trump administration put 25% tariffs on most of the goods that enter the United States from Canada and Mexico, with an exception of 10% for energy products, minerals, certain things like that. Obviously, this is going to have a huge economic impact. Canada has already begun to retaliate with tariffs of its own. American alcohol has been pulled off the shelves of liquor stores up here in Canada. Grocery stores are like directing people to Canadian products to identify what is Canadian, so we're not buying stuff from the United States or minimizing it. I think it would be fair to say that there is like a lot of anger in Canada because of this sense that like our closest ally and friend in the world is trying to crash our economy. And as Justin Trudeau said in the press conference that he gave on Monday after these tariffs came into effect, there's a lot of talk about this being about fentanyl and about drugs going over the border, even though virtually no fentanyl actually goes over the border from Canada into the United States. And there's actually more illegal drugs that come north than go south. And that's not even to mention the illegal guns that come north from the United States that cause a lot of problems here and a lot of problems in Mexico as well by fueling the cartels and things like that down there. But what Trudeau said in that is that it seems pretty clear that the goal of the United States is to weaken Canada, because the United States has been talking about annexing Canada, making it the 51st state. And even if that is not the full goal, it seems very clear that the United States under the Trump administration is trying to harm the economies of Canada and Mexico and trying to force more companies to invest in the United States instead, regardless of kind of the wider ramifications. And so there's a lot I think that we can talk about there, Brian, but I wonder first of all, like, what is the American perspective on what is happening here? Like, how is this being covered down there? How are people feeling about it?
The tariffs are probably like the weirdest and strangest sort of outgrowth of the Trump administration. It seems to be like the one thing that like his policy advisors couldn't really talk him out of. There's been a lot of speculation about what, is really behind his thinking about the tariffs and what he is trying to do. It could be what you said, to try to weaken Mexico and Canada's economies, but it's also weakening ours. Like, the stock market hates this. Like, it's tanking. Like, business advisors hate this. Like, nobody really likes this. I mean, there's a case to be made if you like want to adopt protectionist trade policy and you're going to strengthen American industries and really go about it that way. But there's no real sort of framework behind that, or developing like any sort of coherent message or policy around that, around cultivating national manufacturing industries or things like that. Instead, he's talking about fentanyl, which not only is fentanyl like coming across the border in astonishingly small amounts, but it's also like he'll reverse the tariffs when seen fentanyl deaths go down. But I mean, they're already going down. It's really unclear, I think, to a lot of people, even on the right, where a lot of this is coming from. There's a lot of anger, a lot of confusion, general what the fuckedness about, I'm coining that term, what the fuckedness. People seem to default to like this idea that like tariffs were sort of in the news back when he was sort of coming of age as like a news consuming, like politically aware person. And in his addled mind, decades later, like for whatever reason, tariffs just get kind of stuck and it's still like bouncing around in there. I mean, Doge, the objectives make sense to conservatives, right? Hollow out the federal government, punish people who have politically progressive or even just sort of like public forward views. It's much more of like a conservative goal than tank the economy in general. And this is going to hurt the bottom line of a lot of companies everywhere. Although interestingly, as we'll talk about, less so probably tech companies who are, the NASDAQ was one of the first to recover, and NVIDIA stock was one of the first to recover after the initial sort of shocks of the tariff announcement went in. So it's a real mess. Only his most sycophantic followers are like totally on board. People are trying to like pretzel logic their way to like, oh, maybe this is good for American manufacturing, but it's not really the intent as proclaimed by the Trump administration. It's this weird fentanyl thing. So yeah, no one really knows what to make of it, and it's probably just a disaster unless he just reverses it again like he sort of did last
and that has been like part of the conversation, right, as to whether that will happen. And so we should probably be clear that we're recording this on Wednesday, March 5th. There has
it might not even be around anymore by the time this goes live.
There has already been discussions about meeting Canada and Mexico in the middle. Something's supposed to be announced today, Wednesday, March 5th. The story could be changed by Friday by the time that this goes live, of course. But I think even then, the fact that this happened and the fact that the United States took this action against some of its closest trading partners, and of course there was an initial 10% tariff on Chinese goods that has gone up to 20% if I am remembering my numbers there correctly. But the fact that the United States has done this like fundamentally changes not just the relationship between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, because the fact that these tariffs are being put in is actually against the trade agreement that was negotiated in Trump's first term, the USMCA, or CUSMA as we call it up here in Canada, because we couldn't just have NAFTA. We had to make 3 different names for it to make it very entertaining and interesting. But I think, as you say, right, yeah, there is like this short-term pain that companies are going to feel as a result of this. And the goal of the Trump administration seems to get more companies to invest in the United States as a result of these tariffs. But even then, it's not like you can set up an auto manufacturing plant or something like that overnight. This is not a change that happens very quickly. It takes like years often to invest in some of the things that Trump would like to see moved to the United States. So the idea that these tariffs are going to cause this like immediate rejuvenation or growth in the American economy isn't necessarily there.
Right, which is the weirdness of the whole thing. And I'm not an economist, but yeah, like, I mean, right, like it's just like if that was the goal, then you would put in place certain measures and you would justify it. You would give certain indicators to industry and to businesses like as to what you were doing, but saying it's about fentanyl and then hoping this other thing shows up. And as you're saying, making it that at the very least, the United States is a schizophrenic, insane trade partner that like can't be trusted to not impose tariffs one day or to walk them back 2 days later, or you never know what they're going to do. And it's, as you've pointed out in some of your writing, it relies on these assumptions that America can do whatever it wants and that industries in other countries will always sort of just accept that and meet them halfway to their terms, accept the terms of like America's economic superpower, which frankly, is not always going to be the case if it isn't already, right?
Just to add to what you were saying, like the last time that the United States engaged in something like this was during the Great Depression in the 1930s. And it didn't cause the Great Depression, but, I've seen a number of people argue that it made it worse by creating this trade war and kind of closing things off and whatnot. But I think I would say, I wanted to know how people are responding in the United States. And I won't speak for the Mexicans. I'm sure that they are not very happy about this. But up here in Canada, people are obviously really angry. So many people have friends and families on other sides of the border and all that kind of stuff, right? And we have had this polling in Canada already that shows that 51% of Canadians as of March now see the United States as a potential threat or as an enemy. That's up from just 7% in February of 2023. So a huge shift in how people feel about the United States up here. And I don't think that will just change if a tariff gets rolled back in the next few days or something. And as you say, if they roll it back for another month and still say that, okay, these tariffs are going to come in April now instead, like that is still not a reprieve, right? You know, we don't want to be constantly being worried that a tariff is going to drop at any time, because that does still have economic consequences if the threat or the possibility of the tariff is always still there.
Especially if the reasons that you're imposing tariffs are completely detached from reality, right? So then you can make up anything you want and impose them again, and there's no reason to believe that you won't. So yeah, it is. It has put the United States trading partners in a ridiculously tough spot, and we deserve every punitive countermeasure that gets enacted against us, frankly.
Yeah, and now we see that Trump has already talked about levying additional tariffs on April 2nd, and that won't just hit Canada and Mexico, but he's planning to roll those out much more broadly to hit many other countries as well, right? That have any kind of tariff or even other forms of like non-tariff trade barriers against the United States, its company, goods and services that would flow into different markets. So the notion that this trade war is going to stop with Canada, Mexico, and China as well is just not reflected in the statements from the Trump administration. And so this is going to have huge consequences. And so, I wanted to expand this conversation out to some of the writing that I've been doing, but I think I would first just say that The Verge reached out to some tech companies to see what they think about this. And unsurprisingly, they didn't have very much to say. Google and Nvidia and Microsoft declined to comment. Amazon, Apple, Meta, Nintendo, and Samsung also have not commented. There's a whole list of companies that haven't. Only Sony said that they don't have a statement at this time. Basically, all of these companies are staying mum because they do not want to piss off the Trump administration and what is going on here. Obviously, we know that Elon Musk is very close to Trump, so I'm sure we can assume that he is fine with these sorts of things happening. And so we can see that from his tech companies and know what the response would be there. But, largely in Silicon Valley, we're basically seeing, as we have seen with these companies cozying up to the Trump administration, that they do not want to piss him off. They do not want to disagree with this policy, even if it's going to cause pain to their customers, to their businesses, or what have you. And I'm sure they're also possibly looking at, a bigger potential prize here, right? In using that leverage of the American government to push back on these other countries, particularly in Europe, around tech regulations in the future.
For those that are primarily software companies, there's probably an assumption that this doesn't really hurt them as much. For someone like Musk, who is such a, already until arguably recently, like Tesla, his company was so far ahead in EVs that maybe he thinks it just sort of gives them an advantage or doesn't really amount to much of a factor. It's got to worry the companies that make consumer tech products more, right? Apple that relies on China as a trade partner. It is really interesting to see how the market sort of reacted as well, how they're like, and they kind of made probably similar broad assumptions as to those I just articulated, whereas other markets are down. That one, the tech NASDAQ stock kind of went back up and Nvidia went back up, indicating that like, the tech is going to come out of all of this okay. Again, like oligarchic vibes, right? Like not just because they're maybe a little bit less vulnerable to sort of the influence or the impacts of a tariff, but you can also assume that they're going to be able to try to get exemptions or favorable treatment. We already saw, I think, the auto portion of the tariffs has been delayed for a month, Trump says, because obviously he wants to minimize damage where he can, maybe, I guess, and maybe somebody convinced him that at least would be a good enough idea to do so.
Yeah, or at least there's been talk of delaying it or something. Or
talk of delaying it. Yeah, again, like it's such a mess, you never know what's going on.
By the time this airs, we'll probably have a definitive answer on that. But
it does say something, right? Big tech thinks that they're so powerful and so politically connected and so powerful on the world stage, and that the world relies on them so much that they don't need to worry about tariffs or a trade war or anything like that, because they just assume that they're going to sail through wielding their power and influence. And they're assuming the sort of the mass dependence on their products, like I said. I think creates an interesting, opportunity to folks that might be interested in seeing a counter Silicon Valley or an alternative to Silicon Valley take root.
Exactly, right? Like, is that bet one that is actually going to make sense and is actually going to play out the way that we assume they are thinking about it? Because we can see in Canada already, 79% of Canadians say they have an unfavorable view of Donald Trump. But in that same poll, 79% also say they have an unfavorable view of Elon Musk now and his companies. And I'm sure that that is like a huge shift from a few years ago when Elon Musk was the electric car guy and the space guy and like doing cool shit and all that kind of stuff, right? And the media wasn't really paying attention or not reporting so often on the bad things and the downsides of all of his businesses because he wanted to be seen in a particular way. Like when you talk about Tesla, for example, and I know we were going to get to this later, but I feel like it's relevant to this conversation, 71% of Canadians not just support tariffs against Tesla, but to outright ban the sale of Tesla vehicles in Canada altogether. That is how much the feeling on that company has changed. The Premier of Ontario just ripped up a $100 million deal that it had with Starlink. We're also seeing efforts in other parts of the world. We're seeing these sales declines in Europe around Teslas. We're seeing greater pushback to efforts to do deals with Starlink in other parts of the world. That's not to mention the kind of firebombs and attacks that we've seen on Tesla superchargers and Tesla vehicles in the United States and parts of Europe in the past week or so. And so that's Elon Musk and that's Tesla. But does that extend to other tech companies as well? In Canada right now, particularly in Quebec, we already have a movement to boycott Amazon because Amazon closed all of its warehouses in Quebec, or is in the process of doing so, because one warehouse voted to form a union. And in Quebec, the labor law says that if the workers vote to form a union, the company has to come to a collective agreement with them. Amazon didn't want to do that, so they pulled out completely. And people rightfully said, don't buy from Amazon. Don't support this company that will do this in our country, right? And so, as you were saying, I do think that this prompts an interesting conversation because we're at this moment where, the US was like the dominant force through much of the 20th century. Yes, we had this Cold War, US versus Soviet Union, and were you in the capitalist bloc or the communist bloc and all this kind of stuff. But particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the United States has been dominant and it has used that power to try to remake different parts of the world to serve its interests. But it seems very clear now that US power is in decline. It looks like, and we've talked about this on the show in the past, that the United States under Donald Trump is dismantling its forms of soft power around the world, right? USAID and getting out of international institutions it's set up to support its own growth. Meanwhile, you have these other economies like China in particular, but others too, that continue to grow, that continue to gain more influence. So is there an opportunity, seeing how the United States has acted, for countries that have previously been reliant on it, previously considered it allies, to start forming separate alliances without the United States, not just to work on global priorities that they have, to support international institutions that they think are important, to stand up for human rights in a way that the United States sort of did sometimes and sort of didn't at other times. And of course, that goes for its allies as well, who went along with it in many of those cases, but also to develop a different technological infrastructure, right? To say, I don't want to be dependent on Amazon. I don't want to be dependent on Google. I don't want to be dependent on all these American tech companies that move into our countries and are now, have always kind of pushed back on regulations and taxes and things like that. But now are doing that even more than ever. As we've talked about, seeing Mark Zuckerberg and Tim Cook say to Donald Trump that he wants him to use the pressure of the American government on European allies to roll back tech regulations there. It seems like the tech companies might be making this bet that they don't need to piss off Trump and that this is all going to work out in their favor. But I think that there's an opportunity in this moment. And I really hope that these conversations start to pick up. We're seeing them pick up in Europe with talks around a Euro stack and digital sovereignty to really build some alternative, some digital infrastructure that says, we don't want to be reliant on American tech anymore. Let's form an alliance between these other types of countries. Let's put in the money, let's put in the resources, and let's do this thing.
It's certainly an interesting opportunity, right? Because it not only is there share this sort of like growing anti-made in America sentiment, right? Where there's the people in Canada, Mexico, Europe.
And arguably not just anti-made in America, but anti-America
Yeah, I mean,
in
all
general.
anti-America, anti-Trump. I
Yeah.
think booing the national anthem and at hockey games and stuff like that. That doesn't happen without some prodding. So there's the sentiment there, but there's this also, the sort of other element, which is that a lot of the products that these tech companies and tech monopolies make have never been worse for users, right? Like Amazon is filled with shitty sort of knockoffs that it's serving you results to Amazon Basics, and it's mistreating its vendors that helped build it up. Google is a mess, larding answers up with AI overview, and now has announced that they're going to do even more of it. Users have not responded to that. Well, Facebook is garbage. It's sort of hanging on thanks to its massive sort of first mover benefit and its built-in network effects. So you have this constellation of products that, I think it's a ripe time for countries that say, we've played by the American tech monopolies rules for this long. Like, why? Like, why do we need to do that? Like, what would it take to make a Canadian search engine? Not what would it take to make an e-commerce marketplace that serves the interests of Mexico isn't exploiting its monopoly power to hurt users and to hurt its partners. So I do think that there's like a big, interesting sort of moment swelling right now where the tech companies may be more vulnerable than they think. And I think that's what's so interesting about the digital sovereignty movement is that it is kind of an opportune time. I think there's a lot of brittleness there. No one's going to unseat Google here in the United States, but if you've got these tariffs and you're looking to strike back and grow your domestic industry, now is maybe an interesting time to make some noise.
Well, and this is where I think the notion of an alliance too, right? Like having some kind of international coming together to work on something like this is so potentially fruitful because on the one hand, the United States has a lot of resources that have allowed it to build this up. And so you're going to need some degree of resources to be able to do something different. And that is where you want a lot of countries coming together to work on this collectively. And I would say like not just, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, places like that, but also like places like Brazil, where I think that there could be a lot of opportunities in working with them, other parts of Latin America, parts of Asia, places like that have a lot in common with the types of values that our democracies, all this kind of stuff, to work with them to try to build up some kind of different infrastructure, some kind of alternative to how these things work right now. And we're used to these platforms being international, being global, to be able to access these things from around the world, to be able to speak to people from around the world. And so we don't want to get cut off from that. But I do think that there is a way to think about this in giving different governments, giving different people around the world a greater say in, what these things are going to look like in different jurisdictions around the world, in making some kind of common standards, common rules, but then also to shape them for local priorities, local needs, local norms, local expectations by doing different forms of federation and things like that people have been talking about for years. But that is less about individual groups of coders kind of coming up with something and more like, okay, we are putting the resources of the state behind this type of a project. And the goal is not just to like make something that is profitable or whatnot, but actually to think about what public good is being served through the creation of this. And I think the one other thing I would say there too is there is also a huge opportunity in this moment where you have all these people who work in tech who have these skills that are in the United States. And I would say there's a fair number of them who would be pretty happy to be offered opportunities outside of the United States right now. So there's great opportunity for Canada, for Europe, for other places to start poaching these people and bringing them in for these types of projects to work on these types of things and to be able to say, hey, you're not just going to be building some stupid app or something that like doesn't have a clear social use or doesn't clearly like make people's lives better, but we're going to draft you into this project to build something alternative that is built around a different set of values and expectations rather than just making a lot of companies a lot of money.
There's a hunger, I think, among many in the US also to support such an effort. So
totally.
We're going to talk about the 18F, which was the Digital Services Department that was eradicated wholesale by Doge and by the Trump administration, where you have scores of really well-respected and widely beloved technologists, coders, open source developers who were targeted by Musk. And I did want to to bring this up because like they were known for being progressive, and there was a diverse group, but there was a lot of LGBTQ people in working for 18F, and they were probably targeted just because of this, and because the MAGA and Musk cohort wanted to make an example of what happens if you dare to publicly be non-white or be trans and work for the government or be public at all, then they can fire you wholesale. I hope this gets some attention. I hope it gets flagged and taken up. It also looks like there might be legal issues with doing such a mass firing that's not based on performance. But anyways, all of this is to say there are a lot of great people who were really interested in building a public, democratically responsive technology infrastructure, and that the moment is ripe for folks to start reaching out and building alternatives to these tech products that dominate in the US as well. I think we are seeing so many trends converging right now, and you know, rightfully so. I think it's a good time to be asking what it means that these 4 or 5 companies dominate the world's internet online infrastructure and govern how it's used to a large extent and throw fits when they're regulated in even a little bit, and what it would mean to build alternatives to that, whether it's by state support or whether it's in like truly democratic, decentralized collectives or whatever it may be. Now is an interesting time to start building that apparatus and to start, you know, working on these projects. So
I couldn't agree more. And obviously this is a topic that we will clearly be returning to. I'm sure that Donald Trump won't decide this was a whole bad idea tomorrow and completely change his economic policy.
Yeah, well, and that's a pretty good segue because our guest today is tech writer, critic, fellow podcaster Ed Ongweso Jr., who recently wrote a piece about Silicon Valley and how it operates that is quite relevant to all of the above. So let's dive in and hear from Ed, and we'll be back soon afterwards with a few more headlines and to wrap things up. So yeah, stay tuned for that too. We have the great Edward Ongweso Jr., podcaster at This Machine Kills, writer of the Tech Bubble newsletter, and writer about town. Ed, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, y'all. Excited to be on here.
We've all sort of crossed paths over the years in our merry band of Luddites wielding hammers, and so it was only a matter of time.
Literally wielding hammers.
Yeah. Literally wielding hammers. Yeah, listeners may not be aware, but at multiple occasions in the past, we've put tech on trial with the Luddite tribunals and sentenced various technologies to get the hammer. We should do that again. We really should make that a traveling concern. How are things in New York these days, Ed?
Well, it's carnage. The crime is up. The streets aren't safe. No one's driving. Manhattan is a ghost town because of the congestion tax. The fare evaders. There's undocumented people on the subways. Illegal vendors.
Are they
vendors.
eating cats and dogs?
They're eating the dogs and they're eating the cats.
Just a dystopian hellscape, sounds like.
It's quite frankly, it's hell.
We need to privatize some more of that, some security contracts, get Uber for security detail in there. What's that company? Did you see this?
I was going to say I know a guy in Turkey, but this company, this beautiful company where your daddy picks you up with a gun.
I think that was a New York-based startup.
From my mind.
I think that the guy, that guy that he's like a VC guy who was.
There's another one that's different, and it's London based, and I think if I remember correctly, I was on Trash Future, and Riley ambushed me with it. I believe it's called Black Wolf. Quality rides and nice everyday vehicles with screen drivers, and the premium ones I think might have a gun.
Are
maybe.
Armed. Yeah. The Uber one is, I think the guy's in New York, but it started in LA. It's armed Uber. It's like the Protector app.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, and to be clear, it's not actually associated with Uber. It's
right.
No. It's just Uber for. Yeah, I'm sure Uber's like
metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah. Please don't associate us with this. Yeah.
Well, I feel like it's a good sort of reflection of where we're at with the extreme inequalities that have been engendered in part by our friendly neighborhood Silicon Valley tech monopolies. So we've been talking about Silicon Valley sort of dominating the internet utterly, but also in this brittle way. And it's really kind of come to the fore with the trade war that's starting up. And Paris and I were just talking about how it's this weird moment where there's all this pushback against American companies and American American hegemony with the stupid tariffs that Trump's imposing on Mexico and Canada and China, and how that kind of like may or may not underline sort of like the giant fragility of some of these tech companies. And then that made me think about what you've been writing about and thinking about a lot, Ed, especially in your most recent piece here about AI. But I think a lot of the principles pertain to Silicon Valley's sort of like modus operandi in general. So the piece is about about the Silicon Valley Consensus, or the SVC for short. You want to tell us a little bit about what this idea is?
Yeah, I've been working on a series about AI for security and context, which is where I'm a senior researcher. So one of the things I think I've been trying to think through are like various origins or starting points for what we understand to be artificial intelligence, or a specific way in which it's getting deployed, right? So I had one piece that was kind of talking about how it's used by some financiers and advocates to re-legitimize or revitalize eugenics as this sort of like, we need to algorithmically, efficiently allocate resources to populations that deserve them, or we can use AI first programs to shock institutions and starve the beast so that they're forced to use our products and services so that we can gin up revenue and support for the product and momentum for the product that way, if there's not legitimate adoption.
Both of those things we've seen, and especially how like the Trump administration and JD Vance has sort of like wielded the logic of AI, right? Both here and abroad, both with Doge, where it's just like sort of this AI logic, right? Where they're cost cutting, but they're not. They say it's an AI first strategy, but the AI is nebulous. And then Vance is on the world stage saying, we're going to dominate with AI without really furthering any understanding of what that means.
And it's worked really well for them. It's going to keep working well for them, right? And the series has kind of been like trying to see like, okay, these are ways in which it's being applied, and it has these origins that in another part we talked about their origins in plantations and the way that labor was sharply regimented in plantations. And when slavery was abolished in the British Empire, they had this crisis about, okay, like how do you replicate the really successful, from the capitalist perspective, margins, control over labor, violence, discipline that you had in the factories. And one way is to do that is to just try to borrow from plantations, and this all happening at the same time as people starting to imagine, okay, like what would it look like if we automated parts of the management process, the division of labor, surveillance and regimentation, if we were able to have terror from a distance or oversight from a distance, and all of these align with early design principles in modern computation. It feels linked to me in this piece because this piece is asking, okay, it feels like everyone is saying we have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars, on building out compute capacity for artificial intelligence. What's actually going on there, right? I think most of the time we hear and focus on, and I think, to a large extent it's right, the hyperscalers, because they are the ones who are spending like between, excluding Meta, but if you're just getting like the cloud ones, it's like 255 billion almost. And then, once you throw in Meta, it's well over 300.
Yeah, and by hyperscaling, you mean like the companies that are just like investing more and more and more in data center infrastructure in the energy,
right,
like OpenAI and Google and Microsoft.
Initially, it was like the cloud computing ones, but now it's grown to be like all these other firms just have massive computational infrastructure now because they've gotten in so big on artificial intelligence, but specifically like the LLM-driven model of artificial intelligence. So it's like, okay, well, these guys are spending hundreds of billions of dollars. Why are they actually doing it? What's the consequence of it, right? And the why I wanted to kind of build on, because, influenced by pretty much everyone's work, y'all's work, by Ed Zitron's work, the myriad of critics we can't name at this moment, but right, it's very clear that these companies are trying to figure out how to propose a use case, and it's not exactly materialized there, but there are ways in which it can be applied, it can be forced through, it can be grafted onto institutions. So the SVC was an attempt to say there are, using AI CapEx, right? We can think of the Silicon Valley Consensus as whenever faced with a new technology or whenever looking at a new technology, how is Silicon Valley going to try to figure out the way to ensure either mass adoption or ensure that there is a sufficient runway for an exit for the investors, or that there's a sufficient buy-in to graft themselves onto key institutions, that they can translate that grafting onto political power or onto wealth or into power over the markets that then, force people to either use the product or they'll have control over the next generation. The Silicon Valley consensus is like, okay, how is it that we are coming to the idea that we need to overbuild capacity for a product whose demand is a big question mark? Why is the capacity being so overvalued despite the question mark about demand and the question mark about actual utility? And why is there so much overinvestment in it, not just from the hyperscalers, but from asset managers, real estate investment trusts, from venture capitalists, from banks, from all sorts of sectors of the economy? Why is everyone shoveling money into it? How much of it is really the hyperscalers are leading the way, and how much of it is also people are trying to get their bag or also trying to manufacture consent for what could be a pretty lucrative grift or what they insist will be like a transformative technology?
Obviously this is something that not just the three of us, but, the people who I think are like in our little community have talked a lot about this notion of investment in particular products, the kind of cycles of hype and growth and kind of the bubbles that happen in this industry and then how they all collapse. What I was interested in your piece, or, one of the many things, was how this actually contributes to the power that these companies have in many different ways through our society. Like, how does this process of investing so much in this, of building up something like data centers to power AI or whatever else in previous cycles, how does that help to expand the power that these companies have and that we're now seeing them being able to wield within our societies?
Broadly, right, there are three kind of planks that I focus on because I think these are all planks that stand to gain a lot. For the second plank, you can sub in a lot of industries, right? So there's AI compute and cloud compute, right? So the firms that are offering AI infrastructure, which is a specialized form of compute from cloud compute infrastructure, are basically saying that, look, you have to buy in to a certain design architecture. You have to buy into a certain model for scaling up the actual hardware or the software into pursuing larger and larger and larger and larger models. By virtue of building these larger and larger and larger models and having incredibly more advanced GPUs and nodes, clusters, servers, on data centers dedicated to them, you're going to be able to get some of the breakthroughs. Maybe we're not going to have a breakthrough in actually figuring out how to create some sort of analog for what thinking is or what thought is, but we can throw enough power behind it that we will create new products and tools and models, and we'll be able to do more impressive things. Just as like an example, right? NVIDIA has positioned itself as someone who's going to receive a big windfall because of how much compute all of these hyperscalers are requiring, because they're building larger and larger data centers, because they're building larger and larger models that need them, right? But I think that NVIDIA has also set itself up in a good way, right? Because most recently with DeepSeek, and I didn't talk too much about DeepSeek, but DeepSeek is, very much into kind of part of this. And the reaction to DeepSeek, a lot of people are like, okay, what does this mean? How are we going to navigate that some firm was able to do more with less? The resulting consensus was like, well, this proves that if we have more, we could do even more. Because now we can do these reasoning models, which just require even more compute, right? Now you need models that are 100 times more, as NVIDIA's chief executive says, they're 100 times more compute intensive. What are they doing? Are they 100 times more effective? Are they 100 times more impressive? Of course not. But they're 100 times more compute intensive. So right there, you get an easy momentum where it's like, okay, next frontier model that everyone is going to take as a basic, that you're going to need billions of dollars to invest in, right? Because you're going to need 100,000 of these chips at least, right? You're going to need a massive amount of racks, a massive amount of servers. You need large nodes to train the models or clusters to train the models, right? So you need a few $billion just in terms of that infrastructure, right? And then you also need the data center itself, so you need the land, cooling systems, electricity, right? So we're already getting to a place where if you do not have a large amount of capital to access that frontier, you're getting left behind. And then NVIDIA also saying, well, every year we're going to make a new chip. And every year, these chips are going to be more energy efficient and more compute intensive, right? And the models are going to get more impressive. So each year, you're going to also need to buy up more and more and more, or hope that you can squeeze more and more out of the last gen. Just on that sort of small level on AI infrastructure, you can already see there's a momentum to just kind of spend money that results in distorting people's sense of what's to come, because they're under the impression, right, if you're making these chips every single year, if you're insisting that they're getting that much more powerful every year, that there is some genuinely real innovation. But if we sit back and kind of just talk about like what the real breakthrough is, it's using more compute. It's not like an actual insight into how thinking works or how to replicate thinking. It's just throw more money at it, right? So that on just one level, right, I think tells us, oh, okay, like they have pretty successfully responded to the issue, the crisis that DeepSeek might have caused by saying, just do more. Just do more and we'll beat that.
And it creates this like self-perpetuating sort of logic.
I was kind of impressed by it because I was wondering how they were going to respond to it. And they came up with it in like, what, 4 days, 3 days?
Sam Altman was like,
that was the talking
our thing's
point.
going to be even better, like in a tweet.
Now it's like now we have DeepSeek. And a lot of you have been buzzing in our ears and you need it. So we now have the model. We have the R1 model on here.
So it's true, and it's interesting that it is just sort of like entrenching this huge sort of infrastructure build on a number of different levels, and in some ways sort of amounts to almost the apotheosis of like Silicon Valley's more recent era, just in that it's like getting like so far out in front of its skis, right? Like I've always like thought about OpenAI in a sense as kind of like the next evolution of Uber, where Uber's like, it's not promising that it's going to be able to automate every digital job. And it had a smaller subset of workers that it was going to, undermine the labor conditions for with the technology. But it also like had to make the case first. It had to like more traditionally, I guess, conquer markets and like manufacture that consent for its services to a large scale before it was anything close to profitable or to sustainable. So the entire AI industry, they're building all this infrastructure. As you say, the business may or may not be there. The revenue streams are pretty small right now, but it's all in pursuit of this semi-mythological goal here. And I think like it could go either two ways. As you point out in the piece, like part of the project now is casting around for markets and trying to find ways that it's going to squeeze some profits out of this. And if it can do what it says it can do at any point in the next few years, then yeah, that'll be a big gain if it's AGI or whatever. That's one outcome, that it can actually get part of the way there or get there. But then there's another part of the outcome where it can't, and the rest of the world kind of decides that like DeepSeek is good enough. A lot of people are pointing to the bubbleness of all this. So I'm wondering now, especially as we have this moment where it may or may not be an opportune time for international tech companies and other countries to sort of mount a counteroffensive to the Silicon Valley model, to the Silicon Valley consensus, as you put it. Do you think it's feasible that they can't graft this onto the state, or they can't graft it onto enough markets that the whole thing is more vulnerable maybe than I'd like to believe?
Well, I mean, yeah, because it's like on one level, right? This consensus, as I map it out, whether we're talking about the AI compute infrastructure through some of these GPUs and specialized infrastructure, or whether we're talking about cloud computing infrastructure, which is the backbone of the digital economy, and cloud computing services are used in almost everything. And the reason why these companies are so beloved by investors is because they're, in large part, because a significant chunk of their income comes from the cloud computing operations, right? That give them market intelligence into competitors that they can crush or copy products from, that allow them to squeeze rents out of also competitors as well, that allow them to also facilitate mergers and acquisitions. I mean, there's a whole lot of
the whole thing. It's a foundation. That's the foundation.
Yeah, it's a key foundational industry that they're in that allows them to enter new industries or crush and consolidate in existing ones, right? Just on those two things alone, the idea that they should be left to our tech sector, which is growing increasingly reactionary, and speaking not just in reactionary terms, but also in vaguely nationalist terms, is a nightmare if you are outside the United States. Also because who are some of the firms the sectors they're aligning with, right? I talked about the fossil fuel infrastructure as the second plank of it, but you could also substitute it with, for example, defense tech startups. But, if we just focus on fossil fuel infrastructure, I mean, they're exploiting cheap electricity ostensibly, right? But I mean, really what they're actually doing is scaling up or sustaining the lifespan of natural gas and oil power production facilities, right? Coal-fired plants of natural gas infrastructure. They're providing tools and software on top of the AI and machine learning tools that they've already offered fossil fuel firms to maximize productivity and maximize how much carbon they can get out of the ground, which is going to increase emissions. So also on just like an ecological standpoint, the partnership that's going on with the fossil fuel infrastructure, the overbuilding of extractive infrastructure, of pipelines, power plants, these are nightmares, right? Of oil wells. I mean, this is all a nightmare because we have to leave everything in the ground now if we want to have a reasonable shot at surviving the collapse of our ecological niche. And these tools are going to not only allow firms to take more out of the ground for less, but are going to inspire utilities, inspire governments, inspire localities to build more with them and keep them online for longer. So on that plank, it's also bad. Yeah, it locks them in. Yeah, I remember you talked about this last year, and I cited that in the piece because I think like the natural gas part, even if people want to quibble or argue about how much of it is solely chasing natural gas, so much as like just a cheap avenue for electricity, you're still building out the infrastructure. You're still keeping the infrastructure alive for longer than it would have been otherwise. And, the second half of the piece, which I haven't even, haven't published yet, also talks about like the financial sector and the geopolitical side are also dangerous and concerning parts that Silicon Valley is exploiting to arrive at this consensus that anything it supports should have as much capital funneled into it as possible. Just on all these levels, this is an existential threat, I think. Many fronts to humanity, to other countries, to people who are interested in the environment and the livelihood for themselves and future generations.
Obviously, there's like the moral case for opposing all of that, but there's also sort of like an economic case for opposing that too. And there's also like a lot of popular outrage at sort of these companies and their figureheads right now. What do you think like the ground for resisting all this right now, and like especially from an international community that might be mad about tariffs and so on?
If people look at how we're developing AI and think the best approach is for 7 firms to each promise to spend $1 trillion over the next 5 years to maybe get a breakthrough, and $7 trillion over the next 5 years to maybe get a break. I would love to sit down with you and talk to you for a few minutes because that's batshit. That's batshit. Each of them are going to spend trillions of dollars to maybe discover the same thing. It's insane. It's insane that this is how we're doing technological innovation. If AI is as important as these firms claim it is, and if the possibility of building an artificial general intelligence is as likely as any of these firms claim it is, why in God's name should we let 7 companies spend more money than some countries have made this century or have logged this century in their GDP? Why should we let them burn it just to lose to one of the other companies who are going to set up a monopoly? It doesn't make any sense to me. And I always find a hard time sometimes talking about the economic side of it as well with people who are invested in it, because if you say this, they don't really view that as a waste, because firms are going to waste $7 to $12 trillion. But can you think of how much we're going to save? How much productivity we're going to have if we have a God in the sky? Can you imagine that?
It's so silly.
It's so silly.
It is wild.
It's bad shit.
Well, but do you think that silliness could come home to roost? Do you think that the conditions you describe leave it vulnerable to a bubble or to...
Part of what I'll talk about in the next 2 pieces is like there are 2 big vulnerabilities here, right? That also inform Silicon Valley moving. One thing, if we just like want to be cynics for a little bit, one way to understand the techno-nationalist swing is that these firms realize they have a data problem. They're not going to get into the internet. In fact, they've built up so much mistrust with the public and with other institutions that paywalls are going to go up, or other, sort of restrictive infrastructure is going to go up that's going to prevent the scrolling that they relied on. And even if they could get past it, there's too much slop on the internet now to get the sort of high quality data they need. But who does have a lot of data? Who could be convinced to also build up more surveillance infrastructure to get even more data? And who could ensure that data is not tainted by AI slop? Well, the good old military industrial complex. Right? So that's one of the ways to understand the techno-nationalist swing, especially amongst some of the AI first firms, is that they're interested in getting high quality data from institutions that are not swimming in it. The NIH or the NHS, for example, is not gonna deal with AI slop the same way that your blogs might, right? That your marketplaces might, right? And in fact, you can even deepen the value of it by partnering with firms that do surveillance products and embed them as a way to offer, more responsive healthcare needs, right? When really it's just, helping to flush whatever model they're trying to build. There's a vulnerability in there in that figuring out ways to complicate the relationship with the military industrial complex before it's cemented. It would be akin to like taking one of the yerks from Animorphs out of the pool and throwing it down a drain or something. It would starve, hopefully, and desiccate. Another vulnerability with the Silicon Valley is the financial sector, right? There's a lot that needs to go right for investors to continue backing this, right? Cavella over at Goldman Sachs is probably the biggest public-facing cynic, at least in the firm, but probably in the investment community on this, it feels like, in that he's just like, there's no trillion-dollar problem for AI to solve that justifies all this capital flow in there. And the second that you start to see real unexplainable, outside of the mythology, drawdowns, that you might start to see panic. And we might start to see it soon. Ed Zitron was talking about how Microsoft is paring back some of the AI CapEx. I mean, this is part of why I published it on Monday, because I had initially planned on doing the whole thing on Friday, and then Microsoft cuts. I was like, fuck, I have to I have to publish some of it. Yeah. I have to publish some of it now. But, he pointed out he thinks that Microsoft is pulling back 3 gigawatts of 3, maybe 4 gigawatts of their planned data center expansion. It's significant because they plan to do 7 in the coming year. So if they're already cutting that, how are they still going to do the 80 billion that they promised that they were going to do? And especially, how are they going to answer questions that raises about the relationship with OpenAI? What are they going to do to soothe fears that this means that something's going on with Stargate? Microsoft is the player, as Zitron points out, to understand what the demand actually looks like. And if they have a much smaller user base than presented, as he talked about in his piece, AI Revolution, they have less monthly users than people expect, less weekly users than people expect, a horrible conversion rate. OpenAI loses money on every single use of its product, to the extent that they're trying to offer a 20,000 per month tier. So
sign me up, man. Sign me up.
Don't scoop our stories at the end of the episode, Ed. This is something that we're talking about after. But listen, man, it's always great to hear your insights on these things. Part 1 of the Silicon Valley Consensus, which is part 3 of this series that you've been writing, is out now, and people will need to watch for part 2. We will put a link in the show notes. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on.
Cheers, Ed.
And we're back from that great interview with Ed Ongweso Jr.
Friend of the show.
He has such a great analysis and is so good at identifying the structural issues with this industry. I always love reading his stuff and hearing what he has to say.
Yeah. If you're not already, go follow him on Twitter and Blue Sky. He's at
on Twitter.
Black Jacobin. Oh, X. Or actually, don't follow him on X. Follow him on Blue Sky.
Yeah. Follow him up,
subscribe to his great podcast with Jathan Sadowski, This Machine Kills.
Yeah, and we'll put his newsletter in the show notes.
Right. Newsletter's the tech bubble. He's up to a lot of great stuff. All right. In our first news hit, it has been revealed that OpenAI is apparently planning on introducing some new tiers for its AI models. Yeah.
I'm going to have to subscribe. How much are they, Brian?
Well, the top tier is apparently $20,000.
Oh my God.
For a PhD level AI assistant, apparently.
Great.
So
I'm sure it's going to be so capable. Yeah.
So for $250,000 a year, you can have a poor simulation of a PhD student producing AI generated content for you.
I feel like you could do that, or you could probably just hire a couple PhDs
for half the price, maybe. I mean, I know AI researchers are a hot commodity right now, but it's a little ridiculous to go that high. The one thing I want to say is that this just comports with what we've talked about in the past, how much narrative and hype and marketing plays into OpenAI's aims, because I mean, I am, needless to say, intensely skeptical that its $20,000 a month tier is going to be orders of magnitude better than, say, its $200 a month tier or even its free tier. So this whole proposition rests on Sam Altman or its head of sales being able to convince whoever might need it, whichever company might need something like this, that it's worth shelling out millions of dollars for just a few seats on this enterprise service.
Some hacker needs to break into the company after it releases this tier to find out who is subscribing, so we can publicly shame them, because This is ridiculous.
Yeah, not even Klarna, noted OpenAI fan Klarna will go for this, but yeah, we got it. I guess time will tell.
Another story this week is there is a new story in Business Insider that apparently ad insiders, people in the advertising industry, are advising their clients to make sure they are spending some money on Twitter or X to avoid legal and political headaches. And this stood out to me because, around November, December of last year, there was some reporting that some companies had returned to X to advertise, companies like Disney and IBM and things like that. And there was a story in the Financial Times suggesting that this was going to happen. And, I remember some people at the time kind of pushing back on the notion that this was going to be a thing that would take place. But here is even more evidence that companies are clearly seeing that because of the power that Elon Musk holds and wanting to avoid being kind of the focus of his wrath, that they are willing to throw a bit of money in the X pot just to kind of keep him happy.
Once again, oligarchy vibes, right? You just have to pay up because he's the guy who's in power. It's just like breaking down the free market that the right is so fond of touting, just going straight to basically paying subscription. It's mafia style tactics.
Totally. Well, there was that other story this week that apparently executives or CEOs or something are paying $1 million to have dinner with Trump at Mar-a-Lago.
Just to sit down, up to $5 million, I think I saw, just for one person. Or if it's a group, then you can pool your money to get $1 million. It's just grift that is just being blasted into your face.
The corruption is so blatant. All right, what's our last story, Brian?
Our last story is one that's near and dear to my heart because just is too wonderful. So my former employer, the LA Times, where I once wrote the tech column, has adopted an AI bot that is supposed to provide opposing views.
Is it PhD level bot by chance?
So apparently not, as we're going to see. This one didn't shell out for the $20,000 a year tier on the API there. The owner of the LA Times, Patrick Soon-Shiong, is a tech billionaire who's a fan of Elon Musk and Trump.
Next, you're going to tell me he drives a Cybertruck or something.
Wouldn't be surprised. Cyber wagon, just 3 Cybertrucks chained together. They introduced an AI tool that when you read an op-ed, the AI generates sort of a response so that you can just cut straight to the both sidesism that everybody loves in journalism. But one of my former colleagues' columns mentioned the Ku Klux Klan as, imagine this, a negative force in society.
I can't believe they would write such biased journalism.
Yeah, knocking the KKK, very controversial, but it was controversial enough that the AI bot would not stand for it, and so it said, different views on the topic. Local historical accounts occasionally frame the 1920s Klan as a product of, quote, white Protestant culture responding to societal changes, rather than an explicitly hate-driven movement, minimizing its ideological threat. So maybe the KKK, had some good ideas too, and who can blame them? It was a complicated time.
The both sides bot just needed to make sure both perspectives were in there,
Yeah, I wonder what it would say about Hitler,
Yeah.
Hitler had some good ideas too, quote, LA Times AI bot. Yeah, so obviously this caused an uproar. The AI bot is, at least for now, no more. It has been laughed out of existence. But this is the kind of feature and value that AI is injecting into the space where many laid off journalists have left. Might not have as many journalists. Now you have AI that's both sidesing the KKK.
And here I thought the Trump administration had defeated woke, but it's still getting rid of pro-KKK AI bots. I can't believe this.
Yeah. Maybe it'll be back. Maybe by the time we record this, too.
I'm sure it's going to come back at some point because got to embrace the AI. It's the future.
It's the future.
Great to talk to you again, Brian. Always great to talk about how terrible the world is these days.
Oh, Paris, have faith. This is, I'm sure it can't get any worse.
Well, we'll talk to you guys next week. Yeah. See what's happened. System Crash is hosted by Paris Marks and Brian Merchant. Production is by Eric Wickham. Our theme music is Dystopia by our good friends in Yacht. Support the show on patreon.com/systemcrashpod to get a monthly bonus episode.